I thought I'd post this to alert young men to the dangers of rushing into marriage. Let me first say I recognize my ex-wife likely had some unresolved mental issue back then that caused her psychotic behavior. I hope for her sake and for that of her children that she is now well. With that said, my experience with her was nothing short of a nightmare. This started back in July of 2009 when I met her at the annual auto show in our area. She was hired as a model by one of the car companies to look pretty, pass out literature, and pull people into their area to talk about vehicles. She was so hot. I was immediately under her spell. After mulling around the area, I went back and asked her out on the spot. And to my surprise, she said okay. On our first date, we just went for a drink, and we talked for nearly 3 hours. On our next date, we went out to dinner, then I took her for a walk in a local park where we shared an ice cream sundae. At the end of the date, I took her back to her apartment and she invited me in. As soon as we entered her apartment, she closed the door and put her arms around my neck and started kissing me, and from there, things happened fast. I'll spare the details, but you know what I'm talking about. From that point on, we spent every night together at either her place or mine, and 11 weeks later, she ended up pregnant. I was nervous, but so in love. Looking back on it now, it was probably lust or a combination of lust and love, but whatever it was, I was under her spell. I immediately proposed to her, and she said yes. Now keep in mind, at this point, neither of us had met each other's families or even friends for that matter. Our first introductions with each set of parents went something like this. Hi Mom and Dad, I want to introduce you to my lover. We've been dating for the past 2 months. We then told our parents to take a deep breath and relax, and then we told them we are pregnant and are getting married. Of course, our parents were shocked and very upset by this, and neither set of parents wanted us to go forward with marriage. Oh, by the way, at the time I was 21, and she had just turned 20. I had been working in retail for nearly 4 years and built myself up to an assistant manager, and my girlfriend didn't have a steady job, but was doing contract modeling work and also did food sampling in grocery stores. For weeks, our parents tried to convince us to let things rest before we rushed into marriage, but we didn't. I moved her into my apartment, paid the cancellation fee on her place, and took over the payments on her car. A month later, we got our marriage license, and a week after that, we were married by the mayor. Our parents threw us a really nice reception dinner and even hired a DJ. We had about 50 family members and close friends in attendance. It was the best time. 5 months later, my first son was born, and I was so proud. I couldn't believe I could ever love someone as much as I loved that kid and his mom. My focus was working hard and making money to support my family, which required long hours at work. Things paid off for me, and a year later, I was promoted to store manager with a nice increase in salary plus bonuses. Life was good, and right after I got promoted, we found out my wife was pregnant. I again was so excited about having another child, and we celebrated with family. By this time, both of our families were totally blended, and we were all like one big happy family. It was great. I was living my dream and couldn't be happier. Our second child was born, and it was another boy. Things were going so well, and my happiness level was off the charts at this point. Then everything came crashing down on September 16th, 2012. It was a beautiful late summer day, and I thought I would take the afternoon off and surprise my wife. To keep the surprise, I talked to her just before leaving the store and told her I'd be home around 6 p.m. She sounded disappointed, and we talked next about what she was going to fix for supper. I left the store a little after 1 p.m. and stopped by a local grocery and bought a bouquet of flowers and headed home. When I got home, I noticed a car parked in front of our apartment, right beside my wife's car with the rest of the lot empty. I don't know why, but I instantly had a bad feeling. Something wasn't right here. I just talked to her, and she said nothing about someone stopping by, and I didn't recognize the car. I parked down the lot from our place and walked up to our front door. It was a beautiful day, so my wife had the living room windows open. And as I got closer, I heard voices coming from the window. I clearly heard my wife giggling and talking to a man. I next moved to unlock the door, but didn't. Something told me to go back near that window and listen, and when I did, I heard my wife and this guy making some romantic sounds. They weren't engaged in the act yet, but were getting close. I was out of my mind with rage and about to barge into the house to beat the living daylights out of this punk. But again, something stopped me before I put the key in the door. Standing there, I decided to call 911 instead. I walked away from the windows not to be heard. I told the operator who I was, gave my address, and explained why I was calling. The operator asked what was my emergency, and I told her I was about to confront my wife and her lover and was afraid things would go poorly. She told me to be calm and to not do anything rash that I would regret later. I appreciated her talking to me as it calmed me down a little. She offered to stay on the phone until a policeman arrived, but I told her I'd be okay. I waited a couple minutes and the officer hadn't arrived yet, so I decided to open the door and walk in on them with the flowers in hand. As I opened the door, my wife and her lover jumped off the couch, fully naked. My wife dashed back to our bedroom and slammed the door as this scrawny naked guy stood in front of me. I was standing between him and his clothes, and I just started yelling at him at the top of my lungs. He was silent and had a petrified look on his face. I was about to start smashing him, but thankfully, before I did anything stupid, the officer knocked on the door and I let him in. As I stepped away, the guy ran over and nervously started putting on his clothes. I talked to the officer and thanked him for coming, and told the officer this man was intruding in my home, and I wanted him to be taken away and arrested. The officer told me to calm down and let him ask the guy a few questions. The first question he asked him was what he was doing in my apartment. The guy replied he was there visiting my wife. The officer next asked if he was invited in, and the guy said yes. The officer then asked me if my wife was present, and I told him she was in the bedroom. I went and knocked on the door and called out to my wife to come out, but she didn't answer. I knocked again, and she said she wasn't coming out, and that she was sorry. She was hard-sobbed crying at this point. With this, the officer called out to my wife and said, "Mrs., I need you to come out of the bedroom for a minute as I just have a couple questions for you." As he said this, I heard the baby crying in our kid's bedroom, and walked in and picked him up and started to console him. My wife then came out of the bedroom fully dressed, looking down and crying. The officer asked her name, and she gave it. He then asked her if she invited the guy into our apartment. She was quiet and didn't say anything. He then asked her again, saying he needed to know before he could release the guy. My wife replied no. The officer repeated, "Ma'am, you're saying you did not invite this gentleman into your home, and he is trespassing." With this, she started crying and again didn't answer. The police officer spoke firmly and again asked her to respond yes or no. This time, she admitted that he was a friend and that she had invited him in. The officer then asked my wife and I if this was the apartment we shared together, and we confirmed that it was. He then explained that since the guy was an invited guest, no crime was committed. He then asked the guy to leave, which he quickly did without saying anything but "Thank you, sir." It was a surreal scene with me holding the baby, my wife crying, her lover slipping out the door, and the officer filling out his report. I'll never forget how I felt. The officer suggested to me that it would be best for one of us to leave the residence. I told him I would be leaving, but asked if he could stay until I could pack some things, and he agreed. Hearing this, my wife became hysterical. She latched onto me and started begging me not to go. I was still holding the baby, and the officer told her to back away, which she eventually did. She then sat curled up in a ball crying on the same couch where she was just laying with another man. While packing, I called our mothers, told them what happened, and asked them to come over as soon as possible. They both arrived within a few minutes. Seeing them, my wife started repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over. My mom had my toddler son with her, and he asked why mommy was crying, which broke my heart. I told my wife and her mother that I was taking both kids with me as my wife was unfit, and we would be staying with my parents. My wife pleaded with me to stay, but I refused. Then my mom and I, the two kids, and the officer left the apartment. It was the darkest day of my life. My wife called nonstop, ugly begging me to come home, but I ignored her. A few days later, I met with her at my parents' house. I sent the kids to her parents and had my parents on standby in another room as witnesses. I asked her who this guy was, when and how she met him, how long they had been having intimacy, how many times, and other questions along those lines. My wife just started crying again and telling me she was so sorry and how much she loved me. All the normal bull you expect from a cheater. She then started offering me some limited info, and I knew immediately she was lying. She told me this was their first and only time. I called BS and said she was too comfortable with him, that there was no way this was their first time. She cried and said it was actually their fourth time, and they met at a store. I asked her what store, and she told me the name of a grocery store 13 miles away. I asked her when she went there, and she said a month ago. I knew this was BS as well, as we have 4 grocery stores within 5 minutes of our apartment that we shop at all the time. I then remembered she had a job handing out food samples at that store last year. I told her, "You met him last year when you were out there working, didn't you?" She again started crying and said yes. I asked her if she had been doing this guy since then. She said no, they had just gotten together a month ago. I again called BS. She swore up and down that was the truth. At this point, I was getting nowhere with her, so I ended the meeting. She again begged me to come home, but I refused, stating I still needed time away from her and would be keeping my kids with me. She wouldn't leave, and I had to call her parents to retrieve her. As I was thinking things through that night, it hit me that everything she said about this guy was a lie. And then it dawned on me that my kids might not be mine, especially the little one. The next morning, I woke early and started researching DNA testing near me, and it turned out there was a lab in a little plaza just a half mile from my parents' home. I stopped over as soon as they opened and spoke with one of the staff. She explained the process and the cost. I next called my insurance company, and they said they didn't cover DNA tests, which was over $775 with tax. I decided to go forward with the tests and filled out all the paperwork. The appointment was set for later that day, and I took my kids back, and we all got tested. The technician said that the specimens would be picked up that day, and I'd have the results back within a week. The technician then explained that the results are court admissible, not like some of the mail-in tests you see today online. I got the test back in a week and was destroyed. My oldest son was mine, but the little man was not. I was heartbroken. I quickly fell into a really dark place and became severely depressed. All I could think about was him. How could life be so cruel and unfair? I told my parents about the results, and they too were devastated. I explained to them that I would be filing for divorce, and that I wanted to keep this a secret until I confronted my wife. I then got a good lawyer and started the legal process. My lawyer was a real pit bull. She convinced me to not only move forward with the divorce and challenge of paternity, but also pursue the jerk, as she called him, for alienation of affection and paternity fraud. By this point, my wife and I had been apart for nearly 3 weeks, and she was begging me daily to come back home and recreate our family. At the suggestion of my attorney, I arranged another meeting with my wife at my parents' home, and there I confronted her with the DNA evidence. She tried denying it at first, saying it was wrong, but then admitted it was true. She then tried guilting me, saying, "He's your son, he loves his daddy, and you can't abandon him. You're on the birth certificate, so he's yours." With that, I told her that's not all that matters, and then handed her divorce papers. I then advised her that I would be filing a lawsuit against her and her lover to get my name removed from the birth certificate, and would be suing both of them for fraud. With this, she started begging and pleading again, saying she would never give me a divorce as we were soulmates. I shut that right down and told her she'd better get with her lover and work out a plan, or I'd be seeing both of them in court. I told her to leave, and she refused. So again, I had to call her parents to come over and get her. With that, I called my attorney to let her know about the meeting, and she said I handled things well, and now we just wait until the hearing. My lawyer told me hopefully she'll wise up and sign the divorce paperwork, and the jerk will voluntarily come forward and accept paternity and settle the alienation of affection lawsuit without going to court. He was served papers 2 days later. What I did next was probably not so smart. My wife had been posting on Facebook about our situation without being totally truthful. She was telling people I was angry with her and had taken the kids and made her move out to her parents. I was getting messages from everyone asking me what was going on. So instead of answering each one privately, I made a detailed post on my Facebook, explaining why we were separated, who my wife cheated with, and that I was not the father of my youngest. I have over 1,500 friends online, so news circulated quickly, and I started getting messages of support from everyone. This embarrassed my wife, and she asked if I would take it down, and I told her no. Everyone needs to know the truth. 2 days later, my attorney called, and I told her about the post. She scolded me and said that was stupid. Then she gave me good news. She said the jerk's attorney called her and agreed to voluntarily accept paternity if DNA testing proves he is the bio father, and also to settle the alienation of affection lawsuit for $5,000 if I drop the civil suit. My attorney explained this is really an ideal outcome, as husbands are normally on the hook unless another man voluntarily comes forward and accepts paternity. She went on to explain that getting a settlement in an alienation of affection case in our state is very rare and that I should accept the offer. I did, and we moved forward with getting everything finalized. The paternity case came up first in court. I thought it would be an easy process, but the judge made us jump through multiple hoops. After the initial hearing, the judge delayed issuing a decision on the case for 30 days to review all the information and state law before deciding. When we came back for the final trial, the judge asked the jerk and his attorney a series of questions that had my blood boiling. The judge first asked if he knew the child was his before the DNA test confirmed it was. His attorney started hemming and hawing. The judge had to order him to give a yes or no answer, and his attorney answered yes. He then asked when he knew, and the attorney responded that his client knew about a month after birth. The judge then asked how he knew, and the attorney responded that my wife told him. The judge asked if he ever visited the child. The attorney responded that he had visited every month for the past 4 months. The judge then turned to my wife and asked her if what he said was true. She looked down and said that it was. Learning all this made me sick, and again my mind filled with rage, but I kept my composure. In the end, my name was taken off the birth certificate. We then convened a meeting in a side office at the courthouse where we signed the settlement papers, and I was handed the $5,000 settlement check by the jerk's attorney. It was all finally over, and I felt a sense of relief as I walked out of the courthouse. While I felt happy at first, a deep darkness soon filled my heart when I realized my precious baby boy was no longer mine. I felt so terrible that I sat in my car for over 2 hours before I could muster the strength to drive away. When I got home, I laid in bed and was staring at the ceiling and didn't get up for 12 hours. My wife was a monster, and by that point, I looked forward to divorcing her and getting the witch out of my life, but giving up that baby was the hardest and worst thing I ever had to do. Our divorce was final 2 months later. We split custody 50-50, and I returned to the apartment and lived there until the lease expired. My ex and the kids lived with her parents. I paid her partial child support and 1 year of alimony. I know this part is not fair, but I was fine paying it as I wanted to make sure my kid and his little brother were well taken care of. Unfortunately, the saga with my wife did not end there. Instead, she started stalking me right after the divorce and did so for nearly 3 months. She didn't do anything crazy. It's just that daily she'd show up at my store and sit outside in her car. She'd do the same when I came home. Oftentimes, she'd be in the parking lot sitting in her car or would show up shortly after I arrived. Also, during this period, she would text me multiple times a day, saying she loved me and the kids miss me. I never responded unless it was regarding my kid. She also sent me 2 long emails and a 17-page handwritten letter professing her love and sorrow, and saying all the things she would do for me if I would just give her another chance. She was using my son and the little guy as leverage to guilt me, which really broke my heart and choked me up every time she mentioned them in her messages. I spoke to her parents, and the 3 of us tried to rationalize with her, but it didn't work. Things all came to a head one day when I arrived home from work and she was parked outside my apartment with both kids in the car. Seeing them, I walked over to the car and she got out holding the baby in her arms and my son by his hand. She said the boys missed their daddy and wanted to see me. I asked her what she was doing, and with that, she started crying, handed me the baby and my son, and drove off in her car. I called her parents to tell them what happened and to let them know I had the kids. I told them I'd keep them for a couple of hours and bring them back before bedtime. When I went to drop them off, her parents told me she didn't come home, and they can't get a hold of her. She never came home that night, and never returned any calls or texts. She finally came home at 11 a.m. the following day. Everyone was worried sick about her, thinking she may have harmed herself. That evening, her parents and I had an intervention meeting with her and demanded that she go to therapy. She did, and it seemed to help her as the stalking stopped and she settled down and focused on being a mother. To bring this story to a close, I'm remarried now to a great woman who I met through work. We had a little girl last year and were very happy with each other. Shortly after I got remarried, my ex-wife announced that she was pregnant with a guy she had been dating for just a couple months. Sound familiar? They ended up getting married, and he's actually a really good guy. We talk a couple of times a month when I drop off or pick up my kid. He's a good stepdad to my son and the little guy, which is a huge relief to me. My ex-wife seems to be settled and happy now too, and I am happy for her. The sad thing is, her relationship with her now husband all started with lies. She initially told him I was the father of both kids, and that I left her to live the single life. After he started learning more of the truth, she then told him I was not the little guy's father, and said she had him with the jerk after we divorced. Eventually, she told him the whole story after her parents outed her lies. How do I know this? Her husband called me one day and asked if we could meet for a beer. I agreed, and that's when he asked me to tell him the truth about what happened between me and my ex-wife, his now wife, since she had changed her story 4 times. I told him everything, and thankfully, what I said matched completely with the last story she told him. He seems happy with her. He loves their newborn son, and he takes good care of my son and the little guy, so everything is all good there. Oh, and in case you're wondering, the jerk has had nothing to do with the little guy beyond paying support. He's a total POS dirtbag. In the end, everything worked out well for me, but I could have saved myself a lot of grief, time, and money if I had just been more cautious. To the young guys out there, learn from my story and don't repeat my mistakes. There are good women out there. You just have to look long and hard to find them and then proceed with caution. Keith. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Until next time, I'll see you again. Take care.